Hello and welcome to Beyond Top 10 Tennis. My name is Dr. Ashley Morgan Berge and I'm your host. I'm the author of 11 books, a CEO of 12 years, the founder of a startup set on data privacy, but most importantly, an elite performance coach of over 18 years, having worked with athletes throughout Europe, the United States to Australia. And of course, most excitingly, I am the world's leading scientist on coach and athlete performance, specifically when it comes to developing that top 10 tennis ranking. My work includes everything from mitigating injuries to conditioning behaviors that set a player up long term for the long game towards a top 10 tennis ranking. I'm behind theories from the optimal performance theory, optimal behavior for optimal performance, the barrier breaker, the rule of transference to the golden rule. As has become custom, each episode we dive into one of my books to share additional insights and dig a little bit deeper. We've been focusing on the secrets to optimal performance success, a comprehensive discussion on developing elite coaches and players, with over 40 episodes now to date. Today's topic plays its own role, like so many other episodes, in developing the player, parent to coach for that road ahead towards a top 10 tennis ranking. So, as always, buckle in and enjoy the ride. Thank you so much for joining us today. If you are familiar with where we've been and where you're going, then you understand what today's episode is all about. If you are new, thank you so much for joining us. I would really encourage you to dig a bit deeper into our previous episode, because would you believe it, we are now 47 episodes in, and I cannot believe it, in the best possible way. Though we have been focusing on the secrets to optimal performance success, and recall our previous episode where we actually finished the final chapter and that chapter's segment, which leaves us with a very exciting next phase, because instead of moving on to another book, it provides now the opportunity to really share how these chapters intersect in a manner of speaking. And we touched on that, or we began that discussion last episode. So that's why I'm just sharing. If you are new, I really would encourage you to just have a refresh in a way with our previous episode. But if you've been with us since the beginning, thank you from the bottom of my heart. You know where we're going. And look, we're still focusing today on that coach-athlete relationship. So the chapter begins on page 27, but we've got a few key snippets of this chapter we're going to dive into today. But I don't want to get ahead of ourselves, because the first topic that we're going to carry off from our previous episode is really around talent identification and does it serve its purpose. We do obviously have an entire episode dedicated to this, but it really now, since there's no holding back, I've been able to share those insights from, chapters 3, 4, 5, 2 to 6, etc. And I think the argument here, it's so true, and I can't tell you how many players, athletes, parents, even coaches I've had the discussion with who rely on that talent identification system. And if they do not make it, it's heartbreaking. They think that they're not going to make it. They do not have a chance of progressing to become that professional tennis player. And unfortunately, the talent identification system is broken. And that is, I understand why and where that's come from and how everything intersects, etc. But those responsible for identifying talent are not. More often than not, they do not have a doctorate. More often than not, they do not have the expertise. They have that baseline coaching accreditation/qualification, and they feel as though they know what a developing athlete should look like, and they're performing really good, so they identify them as talent, opposed to looking at if they are conscious of the 7 keys. Have they begun to integrate that into their game? But we can't even get there because the majority of these coaches, if not all of them, do not even have access to the 7 keys. As in, they have access to upskill, but their level of knowledge is not in line with the 7 keys, which is incredibly concerning. Though for the coaches, parents, players, athletes out there, it should be the opposite. Because if you do not make the cut, it's okay. you know better. Now, sure, these systems have those financial rewards on one side, but they do have quite a significant detriment, which I can now touch on, given that I have elaborated on, the different elements of this book. Now, one of these core elements is, we know, and it's essentially what this chapter is about, is that coach-athlete relationship. And my current book that I'm working on, which hopefully will be released before the end of the year. Let's everyone keep our fingers crossed, please. But a significant conversation, and we know is ingrained and embedded in the 7 keys, is obviously that coach-athlete relationship. Now, when you begin or take part in that talent identification system, more often than not, you do not have access to a long-term coach. Potentially, you already have that coach, and then you're taken away from them. So if you are constantly changing coaches and you do not have that longevity, in a manner of speaking, you are losing a key component of the 7 keys. You are losing something that has been underpinned by science, with quite extensive work throughout the sports coaching to scientific literature that has cemented this as a key facet to performance and the progressions. So very early on, if you are flagged as having the talent in one way, shape or form, it doesn't necessarily mean you need to put your hand up or take that, or to make sure you're able to bring your coach with you, or you have that choice. You can look at the landscape of players in general, irrespective on the WTA and or ATP tour. Now, a significant majority of players who break into the top 100 do not or have not been identified. They have not participated in a talent identification program, or they have not done it long term. It may have only been temporary. There are some cases where that has been the case, but that isn't a significant minority. And I think that's incredibly important to share, because if you are not identified, it's okay. And again, this has been touched on in the episode around this. And I think that the most concerning part is the system in place and the metrics, because we can look at it from a more scientific perspective and go, if you are looking to identify a developing athlete, you do not want them to be performing certain skills at this age range, because they are exposing themselves to and increasing the likelihood of the onset of injury. Within, if not within the next 2-3 years, if they are in their early teenage years, then potentially later on in their later or early 20s. And most alarmingly, that is quite common. I know from the sporting scenes that I've been within and or access to and or overlooking, that a significant majority of these athletes I have seen with injuries and developing injuries. And I've had parents even come to me for help, as in, how can I prevent this? And we have to regress to progress. And these coaches, we've had a discussion on negligence. That's essentially what it is. If you are injuring a child without upskilling, that's not okay. And I think a part of me gets very cranky about this, because the knowledge is there, the tools are there, you have access to upskill. Do not rely on just one source. And if you are a part of a federation or have access to a federation, please do, the coaching fraternity a service to direct them here, because if the more of us that are able to do that, then the more we're able to look after the next generation of play. But it's not only that, it's the current generation. Because if you have a player that's 80 in the world, 60 in the world, and their dreams are set on ascending towards the top 10, it's possible. It genuinely is possible. We've got the science on our side, and we can get you there without the heartache. And sure, the argument can be then, if everyone knows there's only a limited number of obviously players that can get inside the top 10. And that's a really interesting discussion, a really good argument, because that's what my latest publication is going to address. So I'll share some key insights, which is a little bit sneaky, cheeky window, because the best part is everyone's lifting their game, and barrier breakers happen every season. And to recall on that, that's in the What Is Your Game Missing series. All links always in the bio. But in the episode notes, the most exciting part of this area is that you can, because not all players, and we know this universally, worldwide, will continuously upkeep the 7 keys and be privy to the 7 keys and have that level of application. A really fun discussion to have is, and I normally don't name drop, but is Djokovic. We know now from even the beginning of this research the applications in this area, so we know why he's been able to sustain his level of play. We also know why Nadal has been able to, despite his injuries, and it was the same with Federer, for example. We know why Osaka won those multiple Grand Slams at her peak, why Swiatek ascended to number 1, why Sabalenka's now number 1. We know why Coco Gauff won her maiden Grand Slam championship. We know why Alcaraz was able to ascend to number 1 and also win his maiden slam, which is super exciting. We also know why Serena Williams has also, or was also able to accumulate so many Grand Slams and maintain her hold at the top of the game for so long. Why some of those players have now retired, that's where our work crossed over. So it crossed over between, let's say, the former of the best in the world, and then once they've retired, we've got new best in the world, for example, and newer Grand Slam champions. And the correlation is incredibly exciting because the patterns of play remain. It's that these athletes are becoming privy to these patterns of play, but not all of them, only a very small number. Now, if you're able to become privy to these patterns of play now, if you are top 50 in the world, you're able to ascend sooner. If, however, you are 900 in the world, or you're that 13, 14-year-old at club level still looking for your big break, you're able to condition these patterns of play now to get a head start for that next generation of play. And I think as it's described at and or on AIMA International, so if you look at the website in detail, we have, it's a race. You want to gain the edge, but it is a race. And it's essentially saying or pinpointing that talent identification aside, it does not matter in this respect, is that whoever has access to these 7 keys and you're able to get a head start, you need to ascend, you need to progress to make that mark. Because at the end of the day, you can either wait for the likes of a Djokovic to retire, to lose his level of application, or you can meet him there. So far, not many players have been able to meet him there. The argument is that Alcaraz has been able to, but if you're looking at a level of consistency, that's actually incorrect. Djokovic's consistency trumps that. You can say the same with Swiatek. Her consistency outnumbers all of the others. Even though she wasn't able to win the most recent slam. Goff's consistency has been incredibly high as well, and Sabalenka's, which is really interesting. And there are some other players like Pegula, for example, who have been able to up the ante in that level of maintenance, so that level of play. So these different performance indicators are incredibly exciting, and we use them, and we've been able to pull them out from our data. But how they, I guess, intersect with talent identification is that the people responsible for this do not know these indicators. They do not have access to these indicators. Hopefully you do now if you are familiar with the text to date, which essentially is that even though there's 11 books, 10 of them are the scientific ones. Obviously number 11 was my fictional release. So if you are privy to and you have upskilled, then you are positioned. So it's saying that they are there, they are available. So for the parents and coaches out there, if your player athlete, it does not align with talent identification, that's okay. You've got the books now to upskill and to take them on that journey. And that's essentially where the text, I'm your tennis coaching guru, comes in. It's essentially a guide of that 10 years of play to get you to that next peak performance that allows you to begin that next decade of play. And it's an incredibly interesting discussion. I'll bet I'm incredibly biased. But when you're looking at building the foundations, the argument is it's going to take roughly 10 years to solidify that baseline. And then you are primed to make your mark, to get that ranking, those initial ranking points, to make your mark then in that second decade of play. So potentially you've started at 8-9 years of age, so that takes you to 18-19 years of age, and then you start peaking. And that's obviously, we've discussed about those peak performance cycles. Some players are going to peak earlier, and that's okay, and in the best possible way, but it's obviously about the level of application and if it is sustained. If it is developed later on, then you know the level of ability to apply is going to take a little bit longer. So by accessing these tools earlier, your chance of peaking sooner obviously increases. Anyway, it's a very interesting discussion to really, I think, dive deeper into, and that's essentially what the latest text to come out next will address, I think, in more detail. But the biggest purpose here now is talent identification and its purpose. It's really the conversations about if you are not included, more often than not, it's a win, because we know the increasing likelihood of developing an injury through these systems, because more often than not the player's body as a whole is not taken into account. And we've discussed in the past on, you know, the individualization to the modifications. If you are in that academy setting where you're not getting that individual attention on a regular basis, you are more susceptible. If you're not being monitored consistently, the height of the ball that you're making impact with, if your footwork is not being conditioned to control that height, then you are more susceptible. And that is a really huge tip that I'm just giving out here, because that is obviously backed by the research and by the science, and that is not in any other coaching literature. That is something new that I was responsible personally as that scientist for uncovering. That's essentially the foundations of this body of work that put me as the world's leading scientist in this area, with my work responsible for uncovering, yes, that landmark finding for the sporting world, specifically with the data, how to develop that top 10 tennis ranking. So we've got the data that points directly there. But data, in my opinion, does not do players, athletes, coaches, parents any good unless it's explained, unless it's shared, unless the details on how is shared. And that is where the books come in. And again, I guess I'm sharing a lot right now because I have had a bit of a heavy writing week, and it's something I really enjoy doing, and I'm really looking forward to this book being released, but it's not done yet. So again, I will try my best to get it out sooner rather than later. But the conversation is really about, if you want to ascend towards the top 10, the pathway is there. So again, if you're familiar with what's available on AMA International and or ACT, you will see the pathway, but also the long game. And what I love so much about the long game, and there's a chart directly extracted from I'm Your Tennis Coaching Guru, and how it shares specific progressions. And the Secrets to Optimal Performance Success has in the past shared something very similar, but also one of my other books, The Secrets to Optimal Coaching Success, shares specific metrics on time frames, on, you know, within that 1-2 years, this is your goal, this is your core objective to get to this point. Then, for example, between 15, 16, 17 years of age, this is what you should be working on. It's going to fluctuate, of course, depending on when you started and what level you were at, because you could have a 10-year-old at the same level as that 14 or 15-year-old, and that's okay. If, for example, you get that 10-year-old gets to 20, that 15-year-old is 25 at the same time, nothing's stopping both of them from being inside the top 10 if they're following, you know, that 10-year pathway. And nothing's wrong with that age gap, because everyone is an individual, and that's why it's so timely to, you know, throw in and address that humanized approach. So every single episode I try is to remind everyone that, you know, athletes, coaches, parents, we're all human, we're all individuals. So we say that humanized approach, so the applicability, the application in the real world. And we get there by acknowledging the differences, and that each tennis player, each athlete is an individual, so they're going to have varying rates of progress. Some athletes, players, are going to progress sooner. Others are going to take a bit longer, and there is no right or wrong. At the end of the day, you might have that athlete who wins their initial Grand Slam at 20, and then their second Grand Slam could be at 24. You could have someone who wins their first Grand Slam at 26 and they win their second Grand Slam in the same year. So eventually, over that 10, 20 years of play, it's almost those outputs and the outcomes of the results are parallel. And so they're very comparable, irrespective of the initial rate of progress, which is just incredibly important to be mindful of. And tracking back to the talent identification systems, they do not take this into account. There are literally age point cutoffs, which is again very disheartening, because we also know that 14, 15-year-old may not have learned those key tools yet, or they are slowly progressing towards them, and they may be incredibly quick at learning these new tools compared to that younger athlete who has already learned them but is still finding the ropes, so to speak. So after that 5-10 years, both athletes, even though their ages vary, so they're obviously a few years apart, they could be at the same rate. And so it doesn't necessarily matter at what time and or age they began. That is why, I'm sure you can tell, when it comes to talent identification, I'm not a very big fan, because I think it does not give all athletes that chance. It is not equal, and I'm a big proponent of making sure there's that balanced outcome, of making sure each athlete, player, individual, boy, girl is treated as the athlete, as a whole athlete, and there is no, I think, bias in that respect. And there could be that player that's been given a head start, which is incredible and awesome for them, and you could have a player that who was not given that advantage, but that does not mean they don't have the skills. More often than not, if you have two athletes with the same level of commitment and dedication and discipline, and we've touched on those 3 Ds in the past, determination, dedication, and discipline, and they get the right guidance, they will improve quite steadily together. But, and this is so important, they are not going to achieve the same results. And you go, why? If they're being taught the same, they're learning the same skills, it's again that humanized approach. Everyone is different. However, if they have access to the 7 keys and they are receiving those key modifications specific for them, for their style of play, as they learn the patterns of play and as they keep learning the newer progressions and their game continues to progress, yes, that is incredibly possible. However, the likelihood of having a coach to be able to do that is incredibly small, because they will not be privy to the 7 keys. If they are privy to the 7 keys and they understand how to apply the 7 keys and they are continuously implementing the 7 keys, yes. For more on that, I'm going to dig deeper and deeper into that again when this current book is released. So I hope this is really sharing why it's so important to get your hands onto, because it really pieces together the whole athlete in delivering that top 10 tennis ranking. Okay, that's a lot on talent identification. So let's dive into it is quite a detour, but we have enough time today. And again, it is in that coach-athlete relationship, remember. So we started off with this chapter includes the coach-parent relationship, the discussion around hiring and firing your coach. So both of those two topics were in our previous episode. So next up was talent identification, which we've touched on. And then the fourth, so 1.4 on page 44 is actually on depression and anxiety in sport, invisibility, and how coaches can help. It's quite, I think, a serious discussion, but I'm going to try and keep it lighthearted. We might get a bit serious, but it is something I think I'm incredibly mindful of, and it's so important, especially now. Because again, this episode touched on, and it's obviously one of our very early episodes, back 10, 20 years ago, when you're looking at mental health, it was about mental conditioning. The athlete was actually conditioned and encouraged to put in their work and to write things down and to journal about their performance. How do I know? Because that was me. That was me back then, writing down my notes, writing down what I had to work on. We had a sports psychologist come and talk to us about different tools to cope, things to, be mindful of when under pressure, different things like that. Unfortunately, the landscape has changed, whereas access to that is not as prevalent. And the conversation about access to mental conditioning and or mental health is more often not shared, and it's not a discussion. And I think because it's not understood, and or there is incredible caution there, or boundaries have been put in place, as in some coaches don't want to overstep. But yeah, I think that's an incredibly healthy argument to have. But if you know the importance of obviously managing that whole athlete and providing and or accommodating tools, resources for the whole athlete, that's when you know you're on the right page, you're on the right track. When it comes to depression though and anxiety, I think it's incredibly ironic in a way that it is not part of the discussion and that tools are not being afforded in the sporting context. By all means, sure. The conversation can be had. It's not a coach's responsibility. It's not the club centre's responsibility. No, that is an external issue, not in this context. However, I would disagree, because if you have that athlete, that child, that player coming to you to learn, coming to you to achieve one of their goals, where they've decided at an early age they would like to learn the skills to progress to become a professional athlete. The same applies if you are on the brink of cracking into the top 100. It does not matter at what level you're at. Likewise, top 20, depression and anxiety does happen. Statistically, we know the numbers have increased. Not necessarily from 10 years ago, although they probably have, but it's because we have the data. The data is available to be able to share, whereas potentially, 10, 20 years ago, we did not have access to the data, so we did not know. So, but that opens up a whole other conversation. We're not going down there. We really want to focus on that. It's important to acknowledge it exists. Instead of putting your head in the sand, it's a common expression, and ignore that it's there. It's by going, it's there. If you are a coach out there, the likelihood, if you have 10 players, it's increasingly likelihood that 50% of them are going through something akin to depression and or anxiety and or both, and their sport is more often than not a distraction. But sport can also be used in very helpful ways, looking at your mental toughness, your mental conditioning. And when those tools are applied or learned, they can be picked up and then applied externally. And that is where the big win is that you have the power and capacity as that coach to help these children, these athletes, again, if they're in that developmental age range or at that elite echelon of play, or looking at ascending. So again, top 200, top 100. But if you're giving them the tools to cope on court, again with that humanized approach, more often than not, those tools are applicable externally, so in a non-sporting environment, and you can have that conversation about that. And being available to have those conversations are absolutely fundamental. And again, this episode in full has touched on that. We've got blog posts about these topics in full that really elaborate on this. But now it's about the discussion about you have access to all of these episodes today. So we're looking at how this all interconnects. And depression and anxiety may be a constant. It could be something we know statistically for the parents out there. I want to say it's either 1 in 3 or 1 in 4. So please don't quote me on that. Will experience that in their lifetime, but we also know the prevalence out there for the younger generation. So when I say younger, I'll cap that at, let's say, 20 years of age. So if you're 20 years of age or younger, we know that depression and anxiety is incredibly more prevalent now than it ever was. And there's, a lot of data out there about why, etc. Because, technology where it was, access, the social networks, etc. were not available 20 years ago. So times have changed, the landscape has changed, that's a very big can of worms, which can be incredibly concerning. But especially for the parents and or guardians out there, this isn't to concern you, it is to empower you by saying, if you find that right coach-athlete relationship for your child, and let's bring in that triangular approach where the parent-coach has that relationship, so that really healthy rapport where you're able to have those open discussions, to keep tabs on that your child, that player, the athlete, on their performance, but then also be able to say, maybe things have not been going to plan off court. Maybe they've been struggling with something off court. Now, maybe certain tools on court can be integrated to help them look at different coping mechanisms or different tools they can apply off court that are incredibly effective on court. So it's kind of a very helpful and conducive discussion to be able to have by empowering that tennis player. Now, I'm going to specifically address the higher performing players here. So the ones top 200, top 100, or maybe you're like top 80. You're not quite towards that more elite echelon of play, but you know what? If you're in top 100, you're doing an exceptional job. So please remember that you have come such a long way, and you should be so incredibly proud of yourself. I think though, within those ranking ranges, you do not have access to these tools like you should have. So this is a conversation to say, to have access, you can read up on the blogs and obviously these books, etc. But I would encourage you to invest in a sports psychologist and or psychologist that you know is helpful for your performance, or to upskill as well. There are different ways and or approaches. Even better if you have your coach and you have that really healthy triangular relationship as well, to be able to have those discussions, to be able to lean on them. That is incredibly important. So if you are looking at ascending towards, top 30, top 20, top 10, that coach-athlete relationship is incredibly important to be able to lean on in these times, because we can look at the topic about the invisibility and how coaches can help, and being able to simply have access to them and have those conversations is all it takes. Sometimes, obviously, other times there are different or varying strategies that can be employed. Now, of course, there are exceptions to the rule. This is very generalized to accommodate more. However, you do have, on a smaller refined scale, players that are completely okay, or they will share they're completely okay. I'm not going to name drop, but there are some players, quite popular players, that have poor behaviours on court, and they have come out by saying their off-court life has not been very helpful or effective for their performance. Their on-court performance has been exceptional, and they've performed quite well in Grand Slams, and their ranking has ascended inside the top 20. Not quite to the top 10, but they've had a heck of a run. But their off-court health, when it comes to depression and anxiety, is incredibly exacerbated. It is amplified. So their behaviour on court is quite poor. Now, these examples, they do happen from time to time, and these are the type of players that could really benefit from help in this area. And it's really giving them the tools to take back the control of their life and performance. Behavior is one thing. Whether they want to continue behaving that way or not is obviously ethical/moral choice. And every individual, player, coach, parent has a choice on how they choose to behave. However, when we're looking at performance and helping that performance and staying inside, I think, the boundaries, for lack of better wording, of the sport, so the rulers that govern the sport, to be able to perform a certain way and adhere to the code of conduct, you want to make sure that mentally that you are on the right page, that you're looking after your mental health to be able to gauge if that behavior is conducive for your performance, opposed with that behavior and your performance that is also breaking the rules and or crossing the line of the code of conduct, and obviously setting that poor precedent for off court. And it's a very complex narrative, so discussion there to be had, and some are going to agree, others are going to disagree. And that's okay, because it does then come back to your personal ethics and morals and values, and everyone is going to be unique in that respect. So it's really important to highlight the cross-section there with depression and anxiety and or a level of ignorance about not admitting or putting your hand up to saying, yes, that may be the case, even though we know the invisibility status. So we know that it's not something you have, you're not wearing a t-shirt with depression or anxiety, or, you have mental health concerns that you're dealing with. More often than not, it's something just kept internally, and it can get to the point where it builds up and it builds up to the point where you do explode on court, and it is no good for anyone. And This does happen before, obviously, you reach a peak ranking range, but it also can happen when you've reached a relatively peak ranking range. And it's so important to be able to have those conversations. And I think one of the most exceptional examples in this respect to behaviours would be Federer and Nadal, with I don't think either one of them has ever thrown their racket, or Nadal in particular. I do recall Federer early on in his career was not not on the same page, but then something changed when he started to look after his mental well-being. We do know a recent player who, Swiatek, is absolutely exceptional and has put her hand up that she does have a sports psychologist that travels with her, and you can see by her demeanour on court and off court, she looks after herself and her mental health, her mental well-being. There are some other players that you can see who are very well-rounded, that handle that very well when we're looking at off-court and on-court. Of course, arguments can be had about differences, and that's okay. These are just generalized examples of when we're trying to set a healthy precedent to ascend towards the top 10 and what those type of performances can look like on court and off court. That is not to say that players such as Djokovic, for example, do not have their mental health in check. That is not what I'm saying whatsoever. However, I'm trying to highlight those behaviours. For example, of course, that I'm sure many of us are familiar with, Djokovic from time has thrown a racket, etc. Now, of course, we can acknowledge that may be out of frustration, but we just want to look at managing those levels, and if that is in line with that code of conduct, which of course we know is not the case. So we're trying to stay inside these rulers at the same time. And it would be a disservice on myself to encourage players, athletes, coaches out there to be outside the rules. You are all individual. You are all entitled to do as you choose on court. This is just a guideline to ensure you stay inside these bounds because of, and that is all this is essentially about. But more seriously though, drawing it back to the discussion around depression and or anxiety, we know these are invisible, but we also know that they are manageable. We know that irrespective if you are 800 in the world, top 30 in the world, you may be dealing with one of or something completely different, but you are conscious about your mental health. We know from a performance perspective, if you're conscious of your performance and your mental toughness, your mental conditioning, that correlates then in turn with your mental health off court. So you have that balance, that healthy balance mentally, that can then in turn be amplified and used for your performance. So I think on that note, it's important to wrap today's episode up that we've touched on talent identification, but then more importantly, but a really important discussion about how it can tie into your performance on depression and anxiety, and certain bounds and or boundaries to follow, especially early on. And as you become that adult, you have that choice how you choose to behave, just like that humanized approach. Everyone is entitled to have those outbursts from time, but if you're able to control your confines, in a manner of speaking, if you're able to look after and control your performance, that feeds back into your mental health and your ability to control and manage those outcomes. And at the end of the day, we know how conducive all these moving pieces and parts are on the pathway, on the long game towards that top 10 tennis ranking. Thank you so much for joining us today. That was a bit of a heavy conversation, especially in that second half around depression and anxiety. And I have to, I think, underline that it was very general. And I really wanted to just share those additional insights that were not available in any previous episodes. But really, I did a very good job, I think, about name dropping and the examples of quite a number of players. And again, they were just off the top of my head, very generalized. But examples about performance characteristics that we know feed back into an athlete's emotional and mental health, and also how they behave then on court with those results. It's a bit of a very complex discussion because every player is an individual, but it's really important just to raise awareness around how on-court mental health is just as important as off-court mental health, and how the two essentially intersect. Although early on then, we did touch on and have a very deep discussion around talent identification. And I think more often, if athletes do not make that mark, if they are not identified, they could find themselves suffering from depression and or anxiety. And having coaches with the tools to help is incredibly empowering to help players obviously along their path towards, again, that top 10 tennis ranking. So look, if you want to grab a copy of The Secrets to Optimal Performance Success, please head on over to AM8 International, that is am8international.com. For any comments or questions, head to AM8 or Topic Thread, that's a social platform set on data privacy. To interact with Beyond Top 10 Tennis, head on over to Twitter, Threads, LinkedIn or Instagram, or to catch up on our weekly coaching tips, head on over to TikTok. And to catch up on our blogs, oh my goodness, head directly over to AM8 International and look for the blogs in the menu, or head on over to Medium and you'll find all of our blogs there with different comments from the community as well. And look, as always, I will leave all of the links in the episode notes. For something different, head on over to Pink Octopus Books. That's where my fictional release is. To view this week's question and poll, be sure to visit Spotify if you're listening on one of many of the other platforms. For something left of field, visit Spruik for some random polls. And of course, if you enjoyed today's episode, please subscribe, like, share, and or all of the above would be absolutely phenomenal. For those of you who are interested, we do have scholarships available on AM8 International, as well as options to work with me exclusively to get your performance and nudge you a little bit closer towards that top 10 tennis ranking. So don't be shy and come and say hi. On that note, thank you so much for listening. I am so incredibly grateful. I am your host, Dr. Ashley Morgan Berge, and this is Beyond Top 10 Tennis, and I'll see you next time.